Introducing my Max Block Gladiator. This build is phenomenal. It's the strongest build I've ever designed or played. It is the only build I've ever got to level 100. I've pushed it further into endgame than any other character I've built. It does tier 17 maps with absolute ease, and I've even managed to kill a couple of uber bosses. However, I did league start this in Settlers of Kalguur, and I mastered tier 16 maps with about 200 chaos. It's absolutely ridiculous. And as a bonus, if you're starting it this late in the league, it's going to be even cheaper because stuff at league start is really expensive, especially for bleed. Into the deep end game and getting to the uber bosses is going to cost quite a bit. You're going to want to spend somewhere of the order of 65 to 80 divines. Now normally I would say that this is way too expensive for a build, but actually I've been so addicted to this character this league, it's the only character so far that I've played. And who knew that sticking with one character in Path of Exile is the way to make tons of money. I've made more divines this league than any other. I'm currently sat on about 209 divines. It's just madness. And that doesn't include any other currency, including chaos and scarabs. It's just absolutely insane. Okay, so let's get into the build. The first things we're going to talk about are the offences. This build is a fast bleed build, and it utilises one of the transfigured gems, Lacerate of Haemorrhage. Now I normally hate Lacerate, but I've got this going so fast now that it really doesn't feel bad at all. Those of you who know me will know that I've done many bleed builds, one of which is Bladestorm. You can use Bladestorm with the same support gems that I use in this build, but you will get about half the damage at only 13 million DPS. The current pinnacle boss damage in PoB is showing at 27.5 million, well just slightly higher than that. Now the build actually does more than that because we actually use one of the new retaliation gems, and that's Eviscerate. A hit from this skill can do 5 million DPS on its own, so it's really good for hitting bosses hard. Now, bleed does have somewhat of a drawback. The damage is not instant. It does take a little bit of time to apply the 8 bleeds that we use because we're using Crimson Dance. But once you've got those 8 bleed stacks on and you keep refreshing them, it does an absolute ton of damage. You can see bosses' health just plummet. We also have frenzy charges to increase our attack speed and our damage. And just because this build does a ton of damage doesn't mean it can't tank. I got to 100 after all. So let's talk a little bit about that, the defences. The primary layer of defense for this build is block. Our block is lucky, so we actually have around 87% effective chance to block both spells and attacks. And this is just silly because block is so strong in Path of Exile. What it actually does is if you block a hit, you will take 0 damage from that hit. And that means that 87% of all incoming damage just vanishes. Now that leaves us a whopping 12 or 13% of incoming damage that we have to actually deal with, and we don't go light here either. Now this doesn't sound a lot, but it can still kill us with one-shots as we are right now. And that's if a boss does a critical strike and hits us really strong. So what we need to do is bring down critical strike damage. And for that we have 89% reduced damage from critical strikes from both our shield and the tree. And then for the damage left over, we bring that down further with resistances and armour. Our resistances are all over the normal cap, with the lowest one being lightning at 77%, cold being 78%, and fire being 80%. You can spread that out a little more by changing the gear configuration. And we don't stop there. On top of that, we are constantly fortified. Early on we'll get our fortify from the tree, but later once we get a decent chest piece, we can roll a chance to fortify on it, which will keep us up at 20% most of the time. That means 20% reduced incoming damage. And then our final mitigation layer is endurance charges. We have 5 of these. This reduces both physical damage incoming and elemental, so it's all good. Now that we've got down huge spiky hits, we have to deal with death by 1,000 paper cuts, and the way we do that is by giving ourselves a strong way of recharging our resources, both life and mana. And for this we use life and mana leech. Our mana leech chance comes from the tree. Our life leech comes from 2 different sources. The first one is a ring or amulet, which will give us at least 0.4, and then we get an extra 1.2% chance from blood rage, which gives us both attack speed and life leech. With a life pool like mine of about 6.2k, this gives us a maximum leech of 1246 life per second. This is really rather big. On top of this, when we're not leeching, we have over 300 flat life regen, which just keeps us up there nicely. Now this sounds really good, but there is still a problem, and that is that block doesn't apply to damage over time. And if like me you're really rubbish at avoiding puddles of degen on the floor, it can be kinda problematic. I have two kinds of mitigation for this. One is off the Pantheon, which gives me no extra damage from burning ground. This is really good. And then from the damage over time mastery on the tree, we take 10% less damage taken from damage over time. On the face of it, this doesn't sound like an awful lot. But actually when I put it on, I saw a huge reduction in the number of times I was dying, so it really does help. To prevent us from taking extra damage, we are immune to shock. For this, we use Tempest Shield, which also gives us spell block. We also use Soul of the Brine King as our major Pantheon, and this gives us freeze immunity. Both of the Pantheons need to be fully upgraded so that we get the maximum benefit out of it. Next, let's talk about the mechanics behind Lacerate. Each time we use Lacerate, we'll get 2 slashes in front of our character. You may be forgiven for thinking that Lacerate is some kind of projectile skill. It isn't. It is a melee hit. It's just an almost off-screen melee hit. The main ways of scaling Lacerate are melee damage, physical damage, and area damage. But we don't really want to focus on the melee hit, we want to focus on the bleed that is caused by it. And also, increases to melee damage and area damage do not scale the bleed, but flat physical damage or increased physical damage or more physical damage will. It's quite important to note that whilst we're not going for area damage, we do want to go for at least some increased area of effect. And that's because of the way the transfigured version works compared to the normal version. The normal version gives us increased area of effect as it levels. The Haemorrhage version doesn't, it just gives us more bleed damage as we level. And so, if we're leveling with Lacerate early, which I do suggest, when we actually get Lacerate of Haemorrhage, you will see a large drop in area of effect, and it doesn't feel great. To fix this, we get this area of effect off the tree, and you can also put some area of effect on your amulet. This will give you some hit damage as well, but it's really the area we're after, as I mentioned. Now, the 2 slashes are really significant. Even with our relatively small area of effect, they do overlap in the centre, as you can see here. Any enemy that stands in the centre of these 2 cones when you hit will take 2 hits at once. And this means that potentially we can inflict double the number of stacks of bleed than we normally would be able to. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we do use the Crimson Dance Keystones, so we can inflict up to 8 bleeds, and it's the 8 most damaging bleeds that will deal damage at any one time. So with our attack speed at mine currently around 3.4, I will apply all stacks if the person is stood in the middle of the slashes within just over a second. If they're not in the middle of the 2 slashes, it will take over 2 seconds to apply the same number of bleeds. Now you may be thinking, bleed lasts quite a while, why do I want to constantly refresh it? And that's because whilst we can only do damage with 8 bleeds at a time, the other bleeds are still there, waiting to deal damage, and if you deal a higher damage bleed, it will take over with its damage. And when we get to explaining the belt later, this becomes really significant. Okay, so first things first, Lacerate of Haemorrhage does more damage from both its quality and its level, so we want to get both as high as possible. My Lacerate of Haemorrhage is a level 21 with 20 quality. The first support gem we're going to link to this is Chance to Bleed. This gives us both a base attack chance to bleed of 25% and up to 30% more damage with bleed. We do want to make sure that we have 100% chance to bleed once we're in endgame. This means that every hit will apply a bleed. Any that we miss is a potential really strong bleed we're not going to get on the enemy. The next support gem, and this is really important, is Multi-Strike. At the end game, Multi-Strike will increase our total attack speed by about 50%. It's actually really large. And it has another added bonus that it also increases damage with each hit that it repeats. And Multi-Strike makes our hits repeat 3 times. The third hit will do bigger damage than the other 2, which means if this lines up with a really strong roll on Rizlatha's coil, we will do a really large bleed on the third hit. The next gem in our lineup is Awakened Brutality. Normal Brutality is just fine. It just won't do as much damage in endgame, so it is worth the upgrade. This gem does have quite a sizable drawback, and that is that it prevents us from dealing any damage that is not physical. This includes Chaos. If, for instance, we got a chance to poison on one of our items, Lacerate would apply poison, but that poison wouldn't deal any damage because we can't deal chaos. It should also be noticed that if you try and put a poison stack on an enemy of 0 magnitude, it won't actually apply a poison stack, so you can't get other bonuses from poisoning the enemy. This isn't going to be a huge drawback for us because we don't intend to deal poison, and we don't use any elemental damage anyway because really the only thing that scales our damage is physical. Our 5th skill gem is going to be Awakened Melee Fizz. This gives us up to 54% more damage with bleeding, which is huge. Note that it also gives us a slight debuff to our attack speed, so it will make Lacerate hit that little bit slower. but it's well worth it for the bleed damage, which is really what we're scaling with this build. I can't stress that enough. Volatility is our final support gem, and it's really strong. I'm going to leave the explanation of the support gem until we talk about the belt, Rizlatha's Coil. The belt and the gem really do the same thing, but their bonuses stack. Okay, now let's talk about the skill tree, and first the 3 keystones we use. The first one, Crimson Dance, this allows us to inflict up to 8 bleeds, rather than just the 1. We do get 50% less damage, but the 8 bleeds does add up to more than 1 bleed at 100% damage. Our next keystone is Versatile Combatant. This reduces our maximum chance to block by 10% for each spell and attack block. But we then get 2% chance to block spell damage for each 1 overcapped chance to block attack damage. If we go into my defences here, you'll see that the chance to block attack damage is 68% because I've got something else on the tree. And the chance to block spell damage is 65%. This one is amplified up to about 87-88%, and this one is to about 89%. The final keystone, and this one is really important, is Resolute Technique. It prevents you having to get accuracy in order to hit every time. We do not want to miss. Any miss that we have is going to cost us dearly. Now, while you're leveling, you're going to want to come down through here, grab the attack speed node, and then in here this way. And then we roll out later for these strength nodes, which I've actually cast using tattoos to physical damage. While you're leveling, get this early. This gives us our mana leech really early on, which means we never have mana problems as soon as we're doing enough damage. Then get these bleed nodes and these. We don't get Crimson Dance until about Act 6 when we switch to Lacerate. Before that, don't use it. While you're using normal Lacerate, everything is absolutely fine with its area of effect, so there's no problem there. The moment we switch to Lacerate of Haemorrhage, you want to get these area of effect nodes, as I mentioned earlier. And then we get life here. This gem is really important. Passive skills in radius also grant 6% increased physical damage. And if we look around, you'll see that this strength now has 6% increased damage. This has 6% increased damage. This has 6% increased damage. It's totally insane for the nodes we have in here. Here is our less damage taken from damage over time on the damage over time mastery. And then we get these axe nodes, and bleeding you inflict deal damage 15% faster. More life, armor, additional resistances, and our mastery is you take 30% reduced extra damage from critical strikes. These bleed nodes here, and then we want to get +3 to damage over time multiplier per endurance charge. We have 5 of those, so that's 15% increased damage multiplier most of the time. These nodes are block nodes, and this node here is giving me life gained when I block and mana gained when I block. More armor, and the mastery here is 1% to all maximum elemental resistances if equipped body armor, gloves, and boots all have armor, and they do. The inexorable node here is really good for endurance charge generation. When we get hit, we have a 25% chance to gain an endurance charge. And then these shield nodes here, and again 1% chance to block attack damage per 5% chance to block on equipped shield. Life and armor, life and maximum resistances, endurance charge. These are my jewels. At least one of your jewels should have corrupted blood cannot be inflicted on you in the end game. It's so good. For this one, we also want maximum life. I also want chill reduction, because this stacks on top of the Pantheon, meaning cold has even less effect on us than it did before. The increased damage with wands is useless, but we have 16% increased damage with bleeding, which is decent. The mastery here is going to be 30% increased damage while in blood stance, 15% increased area of effect while in sand stance. We are never in sand stance. We are always in blood stance pretty much. These physical nodes, we come and get these later on, but you do want all of them, and then you want 10% more maximum physical attack damage. Another jewel here, and this is physical damage over time multi, increased attack speed while holding a shield, increased maximum life, and increased damage with bleeding. So there's a pattern here. You basically want life, increased damage with bleeding, and attack speed if you can get it. Now, just a note on the tattoos I got here, do not go overboard, because each time you get this, it reduces your total health because strength gives you health, and you don't want to reduce your strength pool too much. And then on our anointment for our amulet, we're going to get Hatchet Master. This gives us a chance to gain onslaught for 4 seconds on kill. This is up quite a lot when we're outside of boss fights. It also gives us 10% increased attack speed with axes and 24% increased damage with hits and ailments. Do note that on paper, Acrimony gives us more damage, but actually I prefer the attack speed to put more bleeds on, because if we get a high hit bleed, it will outdo Acrimony. Early on, when we don't have Fortify on our gear, we're going to grab these 3 nodes here, and then on this mastery here, we're going to get melee hits Fortify and -3 to maximum fortification. We roll this off as soon as we can get a chance to Fortify on gear. Also note that early on you want to get the plus 30 to maximum life on one of these life nodes. Later on, this 4% here completely beats the 50, but the flat 50 early is really strong. Okay, so that is the tree, and now the Ascendancy. We go Gladiator, and our first Ascendancy is going to be bleeding enemies you kill explode, dealing 20% of their maximum life as physical damage. This is huge for early game leveling. It used to be down here, they've moved it up here, it's so much better. Second lab, we are going to go for Determined Survivor. This basically overrides whatever block chance we have on our shield. So if our shield has 30% block chance or 24% block chance, that gets taken off and replaced with a flat 50% chance to block. We don't dual wield, so the dual wield bonus does nothing for us. And then if we go down to our third Ascendancy, this is going to be more than skill. This gives us lucky chance to block. Now it only occurs if we've blocked recently, but 65% chance to block is quite frequent. And then our last one is War of Attrition. This is broken. It gives us 1% more damage with hits and ailments to rare and unique enemies for each second we've been in their presence. So those big end game bosses, if we're in their presence for 100 seconds, we have 100% more damage. Now, as you've probably seen in the video, most of the bosses in the game don't last anywhere near 100 seconds, but even if they last 10 seconds, that's 10% more damage. Okay, so now the other skills that we're going to use on this character. Our movement skill is Leap Slam. We're going to link this to life tap so it uses our life instead of mana. We're also going to use faster attack so it's a little bit quicker. The last support gem here is Maim. When we jump on enemies at the beginning, they will be maimed and take 10% more damage from us. In the early game, you can switch out Maim for Endurance Charge on melee stun. This will help with our Endurance Charge generation until we can get over to the left hand side of the tree and get some of the nodes we need. Now on to our Eviscerate setup. This gives us some extra bleed damage and also a big ton of damage when it hits. It's Eviscerate, linked to Brutality, and Expert Retaliation. We can add Maim here just to help keep up Maim as we fight the enemy. Expert Retaliation is a new support gem this league. It supports things like Eviscerate and gives them 39% longer between triggering and use, and also 88% more cooldown recovery rate so you can trigger it more often. For our utility setup, and I keep these in my gloves, we're going to have Blood Rage. You want to keep this up all the time. Summon Stone Golem, this gives us health regen. Flesh and Stone, this is great because it can either be defensive or make the enemy take more damage. And Herald of Purity for just some extra physical damage. We have a guard skill setup. This is Molten Shell for more armor. We also link that to more duration so it lasts longer, and automation so it auto triggers. Our final skill is Temper Shield. This grants us immunity to shock, but also gives us spell block. This is actually really useful because it results in us needing less attack block on the tree and less nodes taken. This is also going to act as a utility skill. Early game, it's going to be attached to Culling Strike, which means when someone hits us, they'll get shocked by our shield, and if they're below 10%, they'll just be deleted. And we're also going to put Vulnerability in here, and we're going to manually cast it early on until we get Cull on our axe, at which point we'll change over Culling Strike to Hextech Touch, so that Temper Shield applies Vulnerability. Next, let's move on to our itemization. This build only uses 2 unique items. One is Rizlatha's Coil, the belt, which we'll talk about in a little moment, and then the other one is the Light of Meaning gem, which I've already discussed on the passive tree. Now, only using 2 unique items, would I suggest this build should be played in SSF? And because we use a unique item early, which is Jack the Axe, I would actually suggest that we don't. It just adds so much unbelievable damage that you just cannot get from anything but a super endgame weapon that I just really wouldn't suggest it. Now that said, it does drop fairly frequently, but is it worth trying and then missing? Probably not. Speaking of the axe, what does Jack the Axe actually do to us? Well, it gives us 35% to damage over time multiplier for bleeding from hits with this weapon. This is quite big. It also adds a 25% chance to cause bleeding on hit. That's probably not important by the time you get to it. It adds both increase and flat physical damage. The one I was using was over 300 physical DPS. It also grants a level 20 Thirst for Blood skill, and this does 2 things. It gives us extra damage over time multiplier, but it also heals us. It's so strong early. Now the problem with this is it is an aura that reserves life, so you will be reserving 10% of your life while you're using this axe. Now that might sound like quite a lot, but I still suggest you use the aura. It is so much extra power, and it doesn't feel anywhere near as good without it. You can actually use this axe to do all in-game content except Ubers. And saying that, if you're better at doing bosses than I am, then you can probably get away with it. I would only replace this weapon with a rare one that has a really high roll of to damage over time multiplier for bleeding from hits with this weapon. The maximum roll on this is 59%. You also want increased physical damage, both flat and increased, and over 600 physical DPS really to replace Jack the Axe. Another nice touch is hits with this weapon have Culling Strike against bleeding enemies. This means that we can switch out Culling Strike on our Tempest Shield setup to now apply our Hex. The last roll you want on this axe is increased attack speed. I crafted this at 20%. The axe base should be a high quality Reaver axe. As high a quality as you can get it, over 20. An endgame rare axe is the most expensive thing you will spend on this build. Mine was around 35 divines without the attack speed roll, and these literally can range into the hundreds of divines if you get a super one that's over 700 DPS. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the shield. This wants to have as high a life roll as possible. I picked up a Crested Tower Shield for the flat implicit maximum life and then got another 159 maximum life on it. You also want to fill any resistances here. The most important role on this shield though is you take 59% reduced extra damage from critical strikes. Start off small and keep upgrading until you get the 59%. Flat armor is also a plus. Okay, let us talk about the belt, Rizlatha's Coil. This belt is a bit weird. It adds flat physical damage and maximum life. Get the highest maximum life roll you can. You also gain 50 life when you stun an enemy, which is pretty likely to occur given how much physical damage we do. What is a bit weird, and what gives it all its power, is that it can increase our more maximum physical attack damage by quite a margin. My belt has 40% more maximum physical attack damage. Now it also has a slightly negative roll, which is less minimum physical attack damage. So it basically increases the range of damage, lower and higher, that your weapon can do. And on a normal build, this would be kind of bad, because you could either do a really low hit or a really high hit. The bonus with bleed is that it only applies the highest bleeds, and therefore Rizlatha's Coil gives us much more chance to apply some really hefty bleeds on the enemy. This also stacks with the bonuses on the Volatility Support gem, meaning that we can get some really phenomenally high bleeds. All our low bleeds just won't apply. We want all of our other gear to be both rare and a pure armor base. And with a few exceptions for certain items, there are some common rolls we want to get on absolutely everything. Our first priority is to fill all resistance gaps. We want everything to be overcapped so that if we get elemental weakness on any of our map mods, we can still run them. The next thing we want to go for is maximum life. Every item on our build should have as much maximum life as we can squeeze out of it. This is huge for survivability. 1, it gives us so much life that we can no longer get one shot, and 2, it increases the amount we recover from leech. Now this build does require a lot of both intelligence and dexterity, which isn't prevalent on our side of the tree, so we will need to get a sizable amount of both onto our items. The best place to get this is amulets, rings and boots. On our chest piece, it would also be good to get the craft 8% increased maximum life and X% increased maximum mana. On our gloves, getting a roll of attack speed is also really super nice. Optimally, we would also get a roll of increased physical damage over time on our amulet. It was really difficult so far to find one that has this and decent stats, so I opted for decent stats. The amulet should be a turquoise amulet base because this implicitly has dexterity and intelligence added. On at least one of our rings, we should have a roll of at least 0.4% of physical attack damage leeched as life. This gives us leech even when blood rage is down, and it's so important. Other nice rolls on rings is flat physical damage and also increased global physical damage. Rings are also a great place to get chaos resistance, and we are going to want to cap this by endgame. These aren't the only items you can get chaos resistance on, you can get it on other stuff, but rings are a good starting point. It's important to note that chaos resistance items tend to be the most expensive because everyone's after chaos resistance towards the end game. You can actually get away with anything positive for the vast majority of the game until really you get into tier 17s. If you too are trying to get to level 100, you will want to make sure chaos resistance is capped as soon as possible. You will die far more whilst you have lower chaos resist. The most expensive thing on the build early will be Rizlatha's Coil. Until you can afford this, use a strong leather belt or a Stygian Vice. The last thing, and do not discard this, it is so important for high damage, is a Blood Sap Tincture. This gives you increased damage with bleeding from melee weapons. You want to get this with as high a quality as possible because quality does increase the damage roll. Tinctures are craftable, and the two crafts you want on this are Increased Effect, which increases every modifier on the tincture, and you want to get this at about 35%. You can also get damage over time multiplier with melee weapon attacks, get as high a roll as possible. Now for a decent one on the market, you can pay about 5 divines for these. You can save so much by just buying a decent base and crafting those 2 rolls on it. Just slam it with alteration orbs. Now tinctures are not like normal flasks, they don't gain flask charges. What instead happens is when you activate them, they start to burn your mana, and once you run out of mana they switch off. Once their timeout completes, you can switch them back on again. This means that in long boss fights they are up way longer than standard flasks. They're also really good on our build. Because we have mana leech, we're constantly replenishing our mana, which means until the mana burn reaches our total mana cap, we won't actually get it to switch off. It is absolutely phenomenal the amount of damage one of these adds to our build. It's about 10 million DPS. You have to get one as soon as possible. For our other flasks, we want at least 1 Divine Life Flask. This should have an anti-bleed on it. We also want a Quicksilver Flask with increased movement speed, and a Granite Flask with reduced effective curses on us during effect. If we had perfect flasks, every flask would have gain X charges when you are hit by an enemy. All flasks should be automated to have reuse at the end of the flask's effect. If you don't like this roll, you can switch it out for when flask charges reach full. The last flask is situational. I tend to use a silver flask most of the time, with increased armor during effect. Just before we move on from itemization, let's talk a little bit about Eldritch modifiers. Because we use all rare, each of our helmet, body armor, gloves and boots can have Eldritch modifiers. These are rolled on using Eldritch Embers that drop in maps. For the helmet rolls, we want increased mana reservation efficiency of skills and increased area of effect. For our body armor, we want melee hits have X% chance to fortify. The moment we have this, we can take fortify off the tree and free up those slots for more damage. The second roll should be while a unique enemy is in your presence, plus X% to maximum resistance. I chose fire, and I got +3. On our gloves, I chose increased damage per 100 strength. This gives us actually quite a bit of extra damage, which increases the damage of our bleed. I then went for +1 to maximum cold resistance. On the boots, the 2 best rolls in my opinion are Bleeding You Inflict deals damage X% faster, and X% increased action speed. On to map mods to avoid now. The map mods we absolutely should not run. Physical Reflect. You will die. There's no doubt about it. Anything that reduces spell or attack block chance is also a no-no. It's a death sentence. Reduced regeneration is also very bad. It's important to note that reduced generation doesn't just affect life regen, it affects leech. Speaking of which, do not get monsters cannot be leeched from. Pretty much every other role is runnable. There is one exception. I do not like cannot regenerate life and mana. Whilst our leech lets us do this fine, you can hit scenarios where you just run out, especially if you overhit, and I do this a lot once things die, and then you end up having to leave the map to be able to attack or get really close to hit with your axe normally. Which bandit should we help? This league has changed things a little bit. We now always get an extra skill point regardless of the bandit choice. Early on, I like to help Alira. The extra resistances while leveling are absolutely amazing. You can roll this off later to get your skill point back. That said, the extra skill point on this build doesn't do an awful lot. I just attached it to a shield node for extra damage. If we wanted more survivability, we could help Oak for the extra flat life. Okay, how should you level this build? I leveled between level 1 and 12 with Splitting Steel. Once I got to level 12, I bought a Sunder from Nessa. This has a very high effectiveness of added damage, so it feels really strong when you first switch to it. At level 28, I switched for Bladestorm, and I used Bladestorm all the way up to Act 6, where I switched to Lacerate. I'm currently in the process of remaking my Duelist leveling guide all the way up to the first Ascendancy, and I'll share that with you as soon as it's ready. I hope you found this video useful. If you have, then please consider subscribing and clicking that like button. I have also left 2 Path of buildings in the description. One is a budget version and one is a higher cost version. The higher cost version is the one I'm currently using. May the RNG be with you, and I'll catch you on the next one.